Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, I talk to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. The concept of toxic masculinity refers to certain cultural norms which are considered to be harmful to society and to men themselves. Traditional stereotypes of men as socially dominant, along with related traits such as misogyny and homophobia, can be considered toxic due in part to the promotion of violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence. I'd never heard of toxic masculinity until I came across the now infamous Gillette advert. And of course, since then, social media has been brimming with passionate discussions about this topic. Today, I'll be joined by four brilliant guests to shed some light on this issue. First, we have Deborah Powney, a PhD student at the University of Central Lancashire. Deborah specializes in domestic violence from a non-gendered perspective. We also have Rob Walker. Rob is a researcher at Male Psychology Network. And then we also have Dr. Mark Hoelterhoff, who is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Edinburgh. He's a returning guest here at the DRH show. Mark is a leading expert in psychological resilience and mental health. Finally, we have Martin Seager, a consultant clinical psychologist and researcher with a particular interest in men's issues and male psychology. Thank you all for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Let's start with Mark. Mark, can you define for us what is masculinity and what's your view on toxic masculinity?
I think it's one of these things that for a psychologist, and especially as a researcher, is challenging. You know, when you want to do quality research, one of the first things you do is you want to investigate certain variables or certain aspects, and you have to define them. You have to really clearly state what it is that you're looking at. And when it comes to concepts like masculinity or love or things that are fairly complex and maybe even somewhat abstract, defining these things can be challenging. And I think, you know, when we understand masculinity, in a lot of ways, what we're doing is we've created a concept, maybe even what you could talk about as a socially constructed concept, which reflects patterns, behaviors, things that we tend to notice about the behavior of men. And so we describe these patterns as masculinity. It's a label, it's a word that we use. But I think one of the things that's complicated is that we start thinking of that word as though it's a thing, that it's actually its own identity, when actually it's a label to kind of cover a wide variety of different things, both physiological attributes to behavioral things versus maybe even ways of beliefs or thinking or even societal norms. When I hear toxic masculinity, oftentimes the way I describe it is it's some kind of criticism of certain behaviors or certain norms or certain kind of practices that tend to become destructive. Now, how we define destructive again is kind of up for debate, but these destructive tendencies either have been problematic in the family, they've been problematic in society, or perhaps even more importantly, problematic for the individual themselves. So if somebody is engaging in some of these things that we define under this label as masculine in a way that becomes problematic for them or creates expectations or ways of living or even views of themselves that can be hurtful, then that's when it becomes toxic. That really the concept of toxic is ultimately destructive and not helpful.
And what about you, Rob, as a researcher at Male Psychology Network? Of course, you would be doing a lot of research in this area. I'm just wondering, Rob, when was the first time that you've heard about toxic masculinity? And did you also agree with Mark with his characterization that toxic masculinity is sort of an attack to, you know, traditional masculinity?
Yeah, I think to an extent I would agree with Mark. I think when did I first hear of the term? Very good question. I suspect probably in the early part of, what is it now, last decade, I guess. Like, so I imagine it would be in the early 2010s, I think I would have started noticing the term. I suspect possibly linked with used to be a big fan of The Guardian. I think I'd probably heard it maybe from Owen Jones initially, or someone similar. Yeah, to a very large extent, I think I would agree with Mark's characterization. I think I would, and from his particular framework, I think that's really probably a very accurate way of going about it. I think the problem does arise if we solely see these terms as entirely socially constructed and with no essential underpinnings. So I suppose the meaning of these words, and I suppose that's what we're engaged in to a very large extent, discussing the meaning of words and terminology. And I suppose in order to get a full and proper picture of what masculinity is, you have to approach it from multiple dimensions, and that probably means taking into account biological, social, and psychological elements of what the word means. It has to mean something, is what I would say, and we can't just break it down until it means nothing, essentially. There has to be an underlying meaning, an essence almost. And I think sometimes we're very, very, we find it incredibly problematic to confront the idea that there is anything essential in the modern world. I think that's a problem with the modern world. And we have to confront these extremely difficult, extremely problematic things that there might be essences that underlie the meaning of these words. I suppose, hopefully that's enough to go on, I guess, for now.
And Martin, following up on what Rob said, can you explain to us where do these masculine traits come from? Would you say that this is also a social construct?
I wouldn't say it's a social construct. I would say that societies construct meanings around masculinity in different cultures. But having said that, I would relate masculinity. My whole approach to psychology is that it's biological, psychological, and social. We're integrative beings, so you can't split the body from the mind. So a lot of what I regard as modern gender studies are sort of splitting the mind from the body and assuming that you can construct or change or socially rearrange certain aspects of people's identities or sexualities. Or, I mean, we wouldn't dream now of trying to socially construct sexuality, for example. There's no one who's going to claim that your sexuality is just a social construct. So I find it odd that people can think that gender itself is a social construct. Obviously, it is socially constructed. What it means to be a man these days is changing, and that's fine. But the idea that there isn't something called, you know, biological sex isn't there. It is. Biological sex has a massive relationship to gender, but it doesn't determine it. So I think we get into trouble when we try to be biological determinists and say, look, men have to be this way because they're physically that way, so they must behave in these ways and you can't change it. That would be stupid. Equally stupid to say there's no evolved or evolutionary or inherited archetypes or instincts. And when you look across the world, there are patterns cross-culturally. You know, there's a spectrum, but the average is, as a scientist, we need to be interested in average differences, whilst recognizing that there are spectrums. You know, some men will be more feminine than some women, but on average, men are more masculine than women. Otherwise, there's no point to the whole concept. And it does obviously relate to biological sex, mating, dating, breeding, bringing up children, having families. This is a core part of human species. We're mammals, you know. So of course there are gender differences, but equally we need to believe in freedom to choose. And so societies are going to have a different take on what masculinity is. So the problem is, you know, I agree with what Mark said earlier. Obviously there's a toxic aspect to masculinity, just as there is to femininity. If you get obsessed with your beauty and you have cosmetic surgery, you try to make yourself look fantastic as a woman, you know, and really uber female, that's toxic femininity. You know, if you're trying to use your femininity in a kind of pathological way, but that's not because you're a woman you're doing that. It's because you're kind of using the archetype of femininity in a damaged way. So a lot of what men do, which is damaging, is not because they're men. It's because they're damaged people who, because they're male, their damage will express itself in a different pattern. But obviously there's lots of room for bringing together all these different theories. I mean, and domestic violence is obviously a big area where you can see that people tend to assume bigger differences than there are.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, you know, even things like violence, men aren't quite so, there are average differences in some respects,
Mm-hmm.
but I thought Deborah will be, you know, saying how it's not so different as we think. So yeah, men and women are different, so what, you know, but equally they overlap, but there's a biological basis, but it's not determinism,
Mm-hmm.
you know, people are very different. I mean, I'm a guy who spent 10 years in psychoanalysis. That's not typical, but you know, at the end of the day, men are all different from other men. But there has to be something, as Rob said, there has to be a thread that links different forms of masculinity. Otherwise, the category masculinity couldn't mean anything. You couldn't be a philosopher and say there's a category, but all the different elements don't relate to each other. So the ways in which they all relate to each other is the deeper category, of, you know, which is masculinity, and that really does connect with biological sex as well. I'm not someone who can split mind from body. A lot of the people I work with psychologically, they feel their pain in their body as well as their mind. You can't split the two. Their identity is in their body as well as in their mind.
Mm-hmm. Now, listening from you, Martin, I could sense there's really a confusion and, shall we say, defensiveness, for a lack of better term, when we talk about toxic masculinity. And I would just like to hear from Deborah. What do you think, you know, like when we talk about toxic masculinity, it's not really clear cut what masculinity and what's toxic masculinity is?
Well, to be a bit of an interloper in the conversation on masculinity, I'm going to answer it from two perspectives. The first one is as a female. I am a wife, a daughter, and a mother, and I can observe on a personal level masculinity at all of those stages. And I have to agree with Martin that there is an innateness about masculinity and also personality that's involved in that, as well as the social construction around it. And I could see that the social constructive element varies between how my father was masculine, how my husband is, and how my son is. There are differences depending on the sort of temporal place where we are developing. However, I think I see what you're saying about the defensiveness there, but also what I see as a masculine trait that I've seen as a common trait through those three generational roles is, or what I would describe as a real positivity to masculinity, which is chivalry and protection and care. Now, to give you a very simple example and make this quite a reductionist answer, is my father would help me with my bags when I went shopping. My husband helps me with my bags when I come in the car shopping, and my son, who's 13, also comes out and does it. And it's not that they don't think I'm strong enough to carry the bags that I've brought in there. It's an innateness that they are chivalrous to me. So I don't see behaviours that I would necessarily describe as toxic being utterly attributable to men or masculinity, because as a female, I also see those behaviours mirrored in myself, my friends, female relatives. So although the behaviours might present as slightly different, they are also toxic. So I suppose my issue is not that there are issues with toxic behaviours, but there seems to be a singular attribution to masculinity and therefore to men. There doesn't seem to be an equivalent that is widely accepted towards women and femininity. So that's where my issue lies, as on a personal level, on a professional level, and the subject area that I study, often, certainly intimate partner violence is held up as a complete demonstration of how the patriarchy controls and harms women. From the scientific research that I have, and not just from previous literature, but also from my own studies, that's simply untrue. The patriarchy and patriarchal expectations may explain a very small sliver of domestic abuse, but there are so many different ways that domestic abuse is manifested and is developed that is attributable across any gender, however you may socially construct that, if that's what you do. So I don't see this as being a masculinity issue. I see toxic behaviors regardless of gender.
And it's really interesting to hear your argument about that, because actually most of the people that you would expect to perpetuate the idea of toxic masculinity are female, because just like what you said, perhaps that they don't see it as chivalry, perhaps they see it as the other way around, perhaps they see it those acts as being patronizing. But I'd like to touch upon what Martin pointed out earlier. He said that we have not come across with similar terms that describes feminine traits or behaviors that are harmful to wider society as toxic femininity or toxic feminism. And I'm just interested why this is the case. And I'm addressing this question to anyone who's got an opinion about this. Yeah, but perhaps we'll just pick up with Mark. What do you think we don't have such equivalent to femininity? Why we don't have toxic femininity or toxic feminism?
I think to some degree, when I use the phrase socially constructed, I think what I should probably say is that I think the labels and the words that we use are socially constructed. So I think Rob made an excellent point that words have meaning. And the reason words have meaning is because they're meaningful to us. There's something that are meaningful. And I am probably the least no one would describe me as a subjective social constructionist by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm oftentimes referred to as a materialist and a reductionist because I believe so much in the biological perspective that I don't even use the word mind. So I'm certainly not one to be labeled as a constructivist. I think that ultimately when we talk about these things, about masculinity and femininity, what we're trying to say is this real or not? And then how do we know whether it's real? It's about issues of ontology. Is masculinity a thing? Is it an actual thing? And how do we define it? Is it something that is defined by behaviors or biological predispositions or so on? So when you say, how come femininity doesn't have the same, perhaps there's an equivalent toxic femininity? Well, to some degree, maybe we don't have the word of toxic femininity, but certainly one thing Martin was acknowledging is that there's certain traits or things that we might see that whether it was women or society in general would acknowledge these are not productive, healthy traits. These are not ways of kind of seeing women in a positive light that is useful for society or for the women themselves. If you talk about, for example, magazine covers and the airbrushing and the things that happens on women's bodies and the artificial creation of a feminine perfection, I think that although we may not call that toxic femininity, I don't think there's any doubt that most people would agree it is certainly not helpful and it is in a sense toxic. So I think the phrase and the wording of toxic masculinity tends to come across in more of that sort of social media and political type debate. Rob was saying he read it in The Guardian and that would make sense, right? Because that's a way of characterizing an aspect of what we call masculinity in more of a socio-political way. And maybe we just haven't had that same kind of dialogue with that same label with femininity. But I it's obvious to me that we can identify many things that people might socially call femininity that are not helpful for the society, or just even just when we think about what's healthy. And so I think there is already an existing toxic femininity, even if we don't have that label.
Mm-hmm. I think Rob would like to highlight a point. I think he mentioned something about lack of symmetry.
Yeah, I mean, it was mainly just to say, yeah, totally agree that there are these traits, that they exist and we acknowledge them. Yeah, I think this is essentially what we've been talking about, that we don't have this mirror term. So we have the term toxic masculinity, and we don't, or in mainstream discourse, political discourse, whatever we might call it, there isn't that mirror term. And I think that's interesting in itself, like the very absence of an equivalent term, and the fact that it doesn't have the same social capital or presence in the discourse, that very fact is interesting. And what does that mean? And I suppose then we'd start bringing in, things that we notice and things that we don't notice, things that are harder to notice and things that are easier to notice. And then you'd start talking perhaps about Martin and John Barry's work on gamma bias. And I think that's where it would really come in and explains a hell of a lot. Yeah, and I suppose, that's all I'd note for now, really.
When you mentioned something about gamma bias, it actually reminds me of the role that academia has to play when it comes to, talking about toxic masculinity and essentially trying to shape what masculinity is. So I'm just interested to hear, Martin, would you say that, when we talk about this topic, not just about masculinity, but earlier Deborah also mentioned about patriarchy, do you think that in a way, academia shapes the public understanding of these issues?
Yes, I think you're right. I think it does. I think the opinion formers and the opinion makers have adopted a kind of narrative around masculinity, which isn't necessarily helpful. And we've tried to, rather than just whinge about it, because obviously I know I probably did sound offensive when I started, because the term toxic masculinity is a kind of pairing of a judgmental concept with a gender, which isn't, you can probably do that with any other demographic very easily. It's because you can put the kind of judgmental word with that demographic that shows that particular demographic is actually different, in the sense that it is the one demographic you can actually be negative towards, and people will take that on the chin, because men in many ways are the archetypal masculinity is around protection and is around sacrifice, in terms of dying and protecting women and children, protecting societies physically. The male gender has evolved in some ways to take risks, and risk-taking is then seen as a toxic thing, but actually society depends on an awful lot of the risk-taking that men have done to create that infrastructure which keeps everyone safe, men, women and children. But the idea of gamma bias was a way, instead of just whinging on about it and sounding like a men's rights activist, which I'm not. I'm a psychologist, a therapist. Yes, I'm active in trying to change attitudes, but I'm not.
Martin, I'm sorry to interrupt you. For those of us who haven't heard of the term gamma bias, could you just
I'll try and explain
it to us?
Yeah, gamma bias is a way of trying to formulate the narrative and how it can be analysed rather than simply getting into a battle. So we've conceptualised there are 4 ways you can analyse gender behaviour. You can look at it as doing good, doing harm, or you can look at it as receiving good or receiving harm. So if you're doing good, you're doing something that's celebrated. If you're doing harm, you're doing something that is seen as perpetration, as a bad thing that you should be stopped. If you're receiving good, that's kind of privilege. And if you're receiving harm, you're a victim. So if you go into each of those 4 boxes, which we call the gender distortion matrix, if you look at when people are doing good, the gamma bias theory predicts that when men do good, we don't really emphasize it. So if 99% of people who do something heroic are men, we still talk about men and women doing it. So when we come to, say, perpetration, when people are doing harm, when we analyze bad behavior, even though quite a significant number of women do that same behaviour, we will regard that behaviour in so when men and women are both doing bad behaviour, we will not focus on the fact that a larger proportion of women are doing the bad behaviour than we're doing the good behaviour we celebrated, if you see what I mean. So, for example, if a heroic acts by men are not celebrated as positive masculinity, but bad acts by men, when they perpetrate sexual offences and things like that, are characterised as toxic masculinity. So gamma bias theory says that we emphasise masculinity when bad things happen or when good things are received. So when men do have privileges in certain respects, you could argue, we emphasise that, but we don't emphasise female privileges. When men are victims, we play it down. So there are many male victims, but we don't actually focus on those, so that we get the impression from that narrative, and I agree, this is social construction, so I totally believe things are socially constructed because our gender narrative is socially constructed, so that we actually think that men are doing less good than they're doing and more harm than they're doing relative to women. And I'm not saying, we don't want gender warfare and men are bad, and we co-evolved as a species, men and women, their mums and dads, they live together. We work together, we've co-evolved. But the idea that men are toxic or masculinity might be toxic is partly the result of our own construction. And we're calling that gamma bias, and obviously we need to test that. But it's a prediction, at least it conceptualizes in 4 different categories. And you can then do predictions by analysing the media, the way words and language, as Mark was saying, language is very important. So we can analyse the meanings we attribute to different, I'm coming up now with a theory called delta bias, which is that the same behaviour, if done by a woman, can be celebrated when it's denigrated in a man. Because in a man it's seen as patriarchal, and a woman it's seen as ambitious and strong. So there are loads of ways, but I think the idea of psychologists, we're good at theories of bias, so I think we should be applying that to gender, and that's really where we've started. And obviously we need to test it further, but at least it's a clear prediction.
Yeah, it's interesting to understand why we tend to be very selective when we're trying to understand masculinity. I just want to hear Deborah, because I've been following her work on Twitter in particular, and she's quite passionate about trying to defend masculinity. And of course, when you Deborah, when you're trying to do this, you come in contact with feminists. So do you think, what do you think is the role of feminism in academia? This is pretty much a follow-up on what Martin said. What's your take on feminism and academia in relation to this?
Yeah, I think it's because of the subject area I'm in, because there is a dominant narrative and has been for almost 50 years as of next year, that domestic abuse is perpetrated by men against women because men want to exert power over women, and women are victimized because they are women. And that definition is still used today on the dominant organisations within the UK, where they say that women are victimised by men because they are women. Now, I have a number of issues with that, but for the sake of brevity and the conversation we're having today, I think that narrative is harmful for everyone involved. And the reason for that is that it ignores male victims, and we know that in the UK the reported victims are 1 in 3 are male, and that equates to 786,000. But we have a huge body of evidence that stems right back to when the women's movement started, that shows that women perpetrate domestic abuse at equal or slightly higher rates as men. And we're also seeing that come across in controlling behaviour and coercive control. Now, it's very much, I labelled it in our chapter in the Male Psychology Handbook that domestic abuse is held as the poster child for the harm that the patriarchy does to women. But what it forgets in that model is that if we ignore 786,000 men, as the ONS suggests, as victims, what that means, according to our demographics, is that we are also ignoring at least 700,000 female perpetrators. And one of the indicators from research is that one of the highest indicators of risk of harm to women is the instigation of domestic abuse. So if we don't actually have an honest conversation and start tackling the whole range of domestic abuse, not only are we ignoring male victims, which is what you see me shout hard for on Twitter, but we're also condemning female perpetrators to continue to live in violence and abuse. So it doesn't, for me, that's one of those elements that doesn't help anybody, although it has this image that it's helping women and children. As far as toxic masculinity is concerned in this arena, that's often portrayed, and I believe that it was probably at least the kindling to start the fire around the label of toxic masculinity. So the patriarchy and this vision of a very dominant, aggressive man, usually with his fist clenched, overpowering a woman, is archetypal of, and I don't want to do this, but I'm going to have to, toxic masculinity. But I can absolutely see those behaviours mirrored in women, because often the reason that model is, and that image is portrayed, is because it's positioned as in hand-to-hand conflict. Men, because of the strength-weight ratio, would be more likely to win in a hand-to-hand fist fight, which may or may not be true, because it depends on the individuals and what amount of age they're in at the time. But, and again, this is where the behaviour manifests differently, but still has the same consequences. I'll give you an example of a gentleman that's currently filled out one of my surveys that says even 10 years after leaving the relationship, he can't sleep because his wife used to wake him up in the middle of the night by pouring a boiling kettle over him. Now, that's not hand-to-hand combat, and he was asleep and she was weaponized. But that is still horrifically abusive, physically abusive behavior. So although in hand-to-hand combat, we would, I would put money if I was a betting person on a man. That's not the setup in domestic abuse. And I think for me, the notion of toxic masculinity is that it's framed in such a simplistic manner, and it's framed as a slur. It's not framed in any way to be beneficial, even though it will be described as, oh, but we're just trying to break these bonds that men are under. It doesn't hold in reality. It does in theory, if you're sat around talking about the toxic behaviour of men, or Gillette want to put out an advert to appease feminism.
But justice theory.
Absolutely, and appeal with the virtue flag. But the reality is so much more complex that it can't fit. We all know that the four men that I'm sharing this virtual room with not only have completely different images of masculinity, they'll also have a different view of masculinity and a different way of displaying masculinity. All of which is acceptable. No one is telling anyone that they are displaying the wrong masculinity. And just because you would get angry, and I might get angry, you may get labelled as displaying toxic masculinity, where mine might be appeased as being emotional or upset, or it's the same behaviour and the same outcomes, but it is framed within. I almost would say that the model of toxic masculinity is in and of itself toxic,
Now, I want to hear to Mark, because of course, all of you, most of you here are academics. I think Mark would like to speak about, you know, the role of academic assertion as being the causal problem when we talk about toxic masculinity.
Well, I think what's a helpful question, you know, you asked, and is where is this coming from? And you said academia, and I think I disagree. And the reason I say that is that, first of all, I don't know what you mean by academia. Do you mean the engineering school, the veterinarian school, the people who are school of medicine? Do you mean the people who are doing fashion and art design, or like, which aspect of academia are we talking about? Are we talking about universities or high schools? Or, you know, it's like all these kind of things. And ultimately, what I think we're probably talking about is specific departments within universities and people within those departments who tend to be vocal on social media or on regular media or on things like this, right? And we're really talking about that, because ultimately what academia should be, what I would hope it would be, is about education. And education is about learning. And so when Deborah talks about doing the kind of research that she does, that's academia. When she's investigating the patterns and trends on domestic violence, that's academia, that's research, that's the way that we try to understand what's real about these topics. What are the patterns? What is the data evidence itself? And so I would say that academia is not the problem, it's the solution. That doing proper research and doing research that is geared around gathering actual evidence and not just going with what we naturally assume about things is critical. And one of the things I tell my students all the time is that I don't really care at the end of the day what their conclusions are, as long as they have fully engaged in good critical reasoning, evidence gathering, and they developed an argument that is based on the data and the literature and the research that they've gathered. And, you know, when I'm marking papers, I probably shouldn't say this in case any of them watch this. I almost don't care what the conclusion of their argument is, as long as they have evidenced it as such. And I think that's where academia actually is the solution to this, that when you promote and develop critical thinking, evidence gathering, and making assertions based on what we can observe, not what we naturally think, it's a crucial thing. Because when we look at our thinking, we tend to, and this is a gross generalization, but we tend to have two types of thinking. We tend to have this sort of heuristic, which is a knee-jerk reaction. We have this very simple, you know, men are powerful, men are stronger, men, you know, these types of aspects about masculinity. They're very simplified. And it's because our brains are lazy, ultimately. We are trying to conserve as much energy as possible, and so we tend to gravitate towards heuristics. Algorithms are ways of thinking that require much more of an evidence-based gathering kind of approach. We have to explore different pathways. We have to think about this on a greater level. So when you hear people talking, oftentimes it's just a lot of triggering of heuristics. It's very simplistic, oversimplified ways of understanding things. So even when we talked about domestic violence, you know, we're using these, well, men, you know, are stronger than women, so they'll beat up a woman, or somehow that violence is about a fist fight or something. These are very overly simplified ways of thinking about things. But I would also say that part of what happens is that there's somewhat of what you could call an attention bias. We tend to notice things that are, first of all, meaningful to us. Secondly, that we perceive as a threat. Or thirdly, as something that is going to reward us, something that we see as beneficial. So if I'm somebody who is, you know, I'm watching a Good Morning television show, or I'm reading the newspaper or something, the things that I intentionally see as meaningful are going to catch my focus. The things I say, wait a minute, oh, here they go again. I can't believe they're doing this. That's going to get my attention. Or this could really help me. It's going to get my attention. So we tend to focus on things. So even the domestic violence discussion, currently, and I don't think that any of us have meant it to be this way. We talked about men and women. Well, what about the queer community? What about women and women? What about men and men? So how do you explain domestic violence when there are two men in there? Are you trying to suggest that one's more masculine and one is more feminine? One is physically stronger, one's not? Is boiling water from one and a punch from the other different? So really, we tend to have conversations based on how we construct as things that are important to us. So someone who comes from the queer community myself, I'm like, yeah, so there's a discussion of men and women violence, but I'm more tuned into what's going to be reflective of me and what's important to me. So, and by the way, I'm not here to do a defense of all of academia, but I do think that there's something to be said about, I guess, as an academic, I do get a bit tired of being blamed for those kinds of things, when actually I think in part we're the solution to those heuristics that are overly simplified and frankly not based on real evidence.
Now, Mark, you mentioned that academia is actually a solution. So I just want to hear from Rob. Would you go along with that?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I'm very impressed with what Mark's just said, and would almost entirely agree. I suppose a slight nuance here is so if we're talking about the kind of when stuff catches our attention, I suppose I would talk about that in terms of we maybe have to notice when seemingly that or people that were seen as very reasonable up until extremely recently, the reaction to them when they now go into academic institutions. So I would think of people like Jabane Greer. I think there's quite a long list of that. I think we maybe have to be slightly, I mean, this stuff is so complex. Yeah, I completely, we have to notice like this sort of almost violence of the reaction that dissident ideas are seem to be now met with. And perhaps these can be for historically understandable reasons, but you know, you see, I suppose then we're talking a little bit about cancel culture, and yeah, I completely appreciate that. You know, using the word academia is almost as triggering, you know, as saying, you know, toxic masculinity in some ways, and we shouldn't be trying to avoid like deeply judgmental ways of thinking. And I would agree that this stuff is so complex now, because the word academia or like media culture, it's now, perhaps because of the technology we now operate in, and the internet is an incredibly liberating technology, and everything is kind of being deterritorialized, to use a kind of Deleuzian term. You know, you're having, everything's exploding. Technology is accelerating the process of spreading information. So we had the Gutenberg press a few hundred years ago, and now we've got the internet, which is sending things into accelerating spiral. Like we are going into the rock, you know, there's a rocket ship taking off. And so using the word academia is really problematic, because this idea of academia or media is now deterritorialized, destructured, very nebulous, and disseminated throughout a million different channels. But going back to perhaps, you know, without wishing to go to like to essentialize the idea of academia, I think we maybe do have to notice the reaction when people go, hang on, what about this? And then suddenly they're cancelled, or they're labeled as, you know, the worst words that the modern world can throw at people are immediately pinned on them. And there is this, it's almost like modernity has this kind of quasi-religious structure within it now, that people are seen, if they go, oh, how about this? Then they're seen as heretics. And then we'd have to look at, perhaps there has been this process within the traditional institutions of academia that has been kind of building up this evidence base. And that nowadays, you know, if you come up with an idea, it's almost as if they've beaten you before you've got off the ground, because there's now such a kind of tidal wave of science. And, you know, I suppose I'm less of a materialist, or, you know, yeah. So like, you can't, it's almost like you're beaten before you start within the traditional institutions. But yeah, then we're into very like profound ideas about empiricism and materialism. So yeah, I don't want to go on for too long, but I think there is a few things to think about there, like the violence of the reaction against any heretical or dissident thought within the traditional institutions. The internet might solve this problem. You know, it might be the end of some of these traditional institutions, for good or ill, but we'll see.
What about you, Deborah? Would you go along with that?
Yeah, I sometimes on the receiving end of some of that vitriol and almost cancel culture, which is which I find in and of itself really interesting, and keep a lot of these insults as part of research. because I do think that there'll become a point where we almost have to analyse the causes of these violent reactions from people. And often, although my study covers all victims of all genders, regardless of the gender of the perpetrator or indeed sexuality, if I talk often about male victims because they are hidden. And even though some of the work I do is used in particularly feminist circles, when I'm talking about female victims, the second I open my mouth and start talking about male victims, I will get all sorts of reactions from people that are having a trauma reaction to me, thinking I'm taking their experience away, to people that, and I jokingly say this often, and it's only a half joke, that point the scrawny finger of misogyny directly at me and tell me that I am a victim of internalized misogyny, because there seems to be, and I agree with both Mark and Rob, there seems to be a particular element that seems to stem from a part of academia that is very heuristical in its thinking, because it's binary, and it's very much either you think right or you are wrong, and there is no nuance in between. So even though I look at all victims and regardless of perpetrator, if I mention men, I'm seen as the enemy that is trying to divert attention from women, where I think in the past, and certainly we should be striving for in the future, we should be enabling people to be able to hold more than one idea at a time. And it seems that we've become so simplistic in our view of stuff that everything is binary. Either you're in agreement or you are the enemy.
And of course, it's not just academia. I suppose it's also large organizations. And I want to hear from Martin. I'm quite sure, Martin, that you're quite familiar about when the American Psychological Association published a guideline in 2018 about working with men and boys, and that actually caused quite a media storm because they endorsed the view that traditional masculinity is psychologically harmful. Would you also say that, you know, is academia also has a role, but also what about organizations such as the APA or even a BPS?
Well, they certainly have a role, because just as we rely on science, and I totally agree with Mark, because the answer to bad science is good science, and you know, good science, without it we're all lost, because you know, we're just into opinions and without evidence. So of course we need, even if we have to argue about what constitutes evidence, we've got to try and do that. We've got to try and be scientific. Now, big organizations like the APA, the BPS, if they set guidelines based on the kind of framework that encapsulates an assumption that isn't based on good science, you know, that masculinity, traditional, what even that means, the idea that masculinity is traditional is an assumption that isn't based on good evidence. I mean, masculinity is a gender. You know, you don't say traditional, you know, you don't say, when people have demographic characteristics, like they're old, they're young, you don't call it a tradition. That is who they are. It's your identity. So the whole framework of the APA guidelines is based on a selective sample of types of scientific research, which themselves, I would predict, are already based around the gamma bias we were talking about earlier. So rather than say, you know, things that these kind of things can be harmful for men, it's almost couched in the idea that therapists should now be working with men in a way that is assessing, not treating people as an individual anymore, but actually assessing people in terms of almost trying to convert them from a kind of set of masculine. This isn't very different from taking gay people and saying, you know, let's do conversion therapy. You know, this isn't good. This is pathology. Being homosexual is regarded as an illness, you know, pathology. And thankfully, we've got to a point where people realize you don't choose your sexuality. You don't just sort of construct it. It is who you are. You might choose to be quiet about it because you know you're going to be harmed if you until the 1960s, 70s, 80s, it was hard to even come out, and it's still hard. It's still not something that's totally accepted across the world. So the same with gender for me. It's part of the human condition. If you start taking a specific set of evidence and then you frame all guidance for therapists in a whole profession, in America, that's very damaging. And so what I would say is that academia, of course, can be brilliant and it can be awful. We need academia because we need bright, intelligent, researching and curious minds to look at the world and to tell us what's going on, to come up with evidence that then informs decision makers, politicians, teachers, that we all improve our knowledge and understanding of the world. But when it comes to gender, the quality of the guidelines in the APA is very poor. So what I would say is, yes, I agree with Mark. We need to solve that with good academia, not rubbish academia. So the whole category of academia isn't the problem. It's specific, it's bad, it's lazy. It's probably what, Mark's saying about heuristics instead of algorithms. It's pseudoscience then, because you're taking a heuristic and making it look like you've got an algorithm. But actually you haven't done the research. And of course with our gamma bias theory, we're not saying this is true. We're saying this is a good prediction about what we think is going on, and we still need to be testing it more. But at least we're conceptualizing that there could be a bias going on, which kind of is self-fulfilling. And of course, once you do have a way of seeing the world, as Mark said, we're going to attend to those things and not notice others, because that's also useful things. You can't attend to everything as a human being. You have to be selective in your attention, and that's a good thing. But if your attention is selective in a way that needs challenging, then obviously that's a problem. When I was a psychologist for about 20 years before I even realized men had a gender. I didn't think of men having a gender because all gender studies was basically about women. I didn't think, when I was working with men, I wasn't thinking, what's the gender aspect of my work with this guy? I was just thinking, I was just doing depression therapy So it took me 20 years as a clinical psychologist to even select my attention differently and think about gender differently. And I am a man. I wasn't thinking about myself in a gendered way, in the same way a woman might, because women have had certain different battles, and their identity is partly defined by having to fight in certain ways. But equally, once you start looking at male gender, there's loads of inequalities and problems facing men. But no one's that interested in them because it's more invisible, including men themselves. Men don't draw attention to their own vulnerabilities so easily. So it's complex, but academia has to be is partly the problem, but it also is part of the solution.
And I think it's not also that it's gendered. It's also something I would say as cultural, because I originally came from Southeast Asian countries. I lived in 4 Southeast Asian countries before moving here in the UK, and I could just, I just realized that we don't really attack masculinity in Southeast Asian countries. We don't talk about toxic masculinity. This seems to be more like a Western phenomenon, and I wonder why that is. Perhaps, Rob, you could talk to us about that.
Sorry, just clarify that for me again.
Sorry. When we talk about toxic masculinity, it seems to be concentrated rather on Western countries. We don't hear it from, let's say, Japan, where you would expect to be much more machismo. You don't hear it from Thailand. Why do you think that is? Or even Africa? Why it seems to be like when we're talking about toxic masculinity, it seems to be concentrated in one culture, in one civilization?
Very good question. Is that because, really interesting one. There seems, I suppose,
easy spot, easy target.
I mean, dare I say so? I mean, I don't know. I mean, extremely kind of problematic area of inquiry, I guess. Yeah, really difficult. And I suppose, yeah, are we particularly negative about certain identities within, and is that because we feel that maybe there's a moral imperative to take down these structures that have apparently for a long time
not just statues being
dominated the world? Sorry?
Not just statues being taken down.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's the kind of, I mean, I've been, over the last few minutes, I've been thinking about, is it Galtung's pyramid of structural violence? So I suppose you've got, you know, destruction and violence occurs on many kind of levels. At the top, you've got, you know, large scale genocide and direct violence. You know, a little bit below that, maybe you've got this kind of iconoclasm and destroying symbols and destroying identifiers of this identity. And further down, you've got these words like that seem to be everywhere in the media at the moment. You know, white supremacy, all these kind of ideas that kind of justify the next. You know, the discourse. You create a lot of negativity in the discourse, and then it justifies the next step.
People who do this. What do you think is the aim of the people who do this?
I mean, I have no particular. I'm curious, but I mean, I suppose you could look at history. I guess, like, you know, you look at regimes in history that have created extremely negative discourses around people of certain identities. I mean, you could look at the discourse around the bourgeoisie in Leninism, or, you know, that's a kind of a resentment based on economic class. Or you could look at the discourse in the run-up to, you know, the Third Reich. You know, I mean, but I think it can be, it becomes a bit pathetic when, you know, certain comparisons are, you know, appropriate and certain aren't. I mean, yeah, and I get very uncomfortable when you're kind of, you know, there are degrees of violence, but I mean, I think the connection, you know, I certainly think you can start talking about dehumanizing language, and you can, and that's a legitimate, you know, if we're going to be like intellectually consistent, we can say, oh, there's this discourse, I'm noticing that there seems to be a lot of this discourse. But I mean, yeah, I'm sure there is a huge amount of, you know, a little bit familiar with, you know, seen some, there's a lot of discourse around, you know, cross-cultural comparisons. Like I've seen, you know, in the Eastern cultures, there is an examination of the role of gender in these, but I mean, you know, it's out there, but perhaps some leaks through into mainstream. You know, I suppose if in the European, you know, milieu, we'll obsess over, you know, things that are about, you know, things that emerge from Europe. So we'll perhaps pay more attention to that. So if there's
sort of overcorrection, I would say.
Yeah, would you say? Okay, cool. I mean, that's cool. That's nice that people are starting to notice, I guess. It's good to notice things if it's really getting a really negative. It's good to notice when statues are getting ripped down and stuff. You know, you're like, oh, hang on, I'm sure that's happened before.
Something's gone wrong here.
I'm sure this has happened before in history, and it didn't end well. That's the danger. You know, the danger is that, I mean, I saw a really good, I think it's by is it Konstantin Kristin? Like, he put a tweet thread out just yesterday about how, how this rarely ends well. You know,
Now, let's go back to toxic masculinity and the psychological problems being experienced by men. Aside from toxic masculinity, Mark, would you care to say to us what other psychological problems that men would, you know, experience?
What other problems that men would experience? Well, they would experience all the problems that you can think of. That men are people, are human beings, and so they men and women and people in general have, you know, the possibility of experiencing anything. I think often, though, when we talk about toxic masculinity, what we're tending to say is, are there things that maybe are social expectations of what men should do And again, when we say social, that's incredibly different depending on what culture or country or group you're talking about. But are there expectations of what someone should do that potentially could cause an incongruence in that person, could cause them to behave in a way that is destructive, or, so-called toxic? And I think that that's really where, when we're discussing toxic masculinity, I think for me as a psychologist and someone who's very interested in someone's resilience, and really for them to become the best version of themselves and to live a flourishing and thriving life, is when there are expectations that people either have placed on them or they just ascribe to that really don't allow them to be themselves. I think that's really problematic. We talk, for example, I think, Martin, you brought up the issue of coming out. Oftentimes the discussion around masculinity is basically what is traditionally defined as heterosexual masculinity. So in a sense, even within the queer culture, oftentimes, and again, this is just anecdotally from my experience, is that men will be referred to as masculine acting, and this is interesting because then we equate that to being, quote, straight acting. And so are you one of these gay men who is more feminine, or are you one of these gay men that is more masculine? Now, when you start those kind of attributes on somebody, and you think about the process of coming out, really becoming fully yourself, suddenly you're now having to adopt just new constraints on yourself as an individual based on these constructed ideas of what is masculine. So even in the role of, let's say, a male and male relationship, I kind of made the reference to domestic violence, was one of them more masculine and feminine. So for a lot of couples on which there are gay men, there's a description about, well, this person's a bit more masculine acting. And there's a show that I really like called Modern Family, and there's these two characters who are a gay couple in the show. And there's a few episodes in which there is this discussion. Well, who's the mom here, and who's the father? Because they have an adopted daughter, and one of them refers to his partner as like the wife, and and you see these kind of discussions about masculinity and femininity that end up being characterizations of roles and expectations of what a person should behave like. And as someone who wants to empower individuals to fully be themselves, that's where I worry about some of these discussions. I think, Deborah, you made a great point about being chivalrous and being, in a sense, being protective. And I think there's a value to that. But at the same time, then sometimes men may feel pressured that, they're the ones that have to do this. Sometimes they're the ones that are expected to do this. And maybe based on personality differences, they're just who they are as individuals, they may not be the best one to do this. It might be that somebody else, maybe it's a woman, or maybe it's their partner, and maybe somebody has better skills at that. And so when we kind of put expectations on people's behavior based purely on what we identify them as, or maybe even they self-identify, I get nervous about that. I need to act this way because I'm a man. I need to think this way because I'm a man. I need to even eat this way because I'm a man. You can't be a vegan or plant-based because that's not masculine. Now, when we start talking about those kinds of characterizations of masculinity, I think personally that's ridiculous. I think when we start having discussions in which people are supposed to behave in a certain way because how we think what is masculine or feminine, I think that's destructive and toxic.
Now, we're already running out of time, but I want to hear from Deborah. I think what I want to hear from Deborah is, what's the takeaway? I think you would like to talk about postmodernism and in relation to toxic masculinity.
Yeah, I think there's what I'd like to do first is agree with Mark that we seem to talk in these very reductionist terms, that it's about toxic masculinity and what it means to be a man, but we forget there's a lot of layers to people in various forms, even throughout an ordinary day. You can go from being partner, friend, mother, father, work colleague, and there's various different kinds of behaviour that are expected or otherwise on those various elements. And I suppose I kind of think my brain thinks in pictures, and I see everyone as a kind of a graphic equalizer, and you will have various traits throughout, and those various levels will move and fluctuate, not just based on your gender, but based on where you are, who you're with, what you're doing. There's so many complexities to it. And that's one of the reasons I find the label of toxic masculinity problematic in and of itself, because it's trying to define something that, even if it does exist, will be fleeting depending on that situation and what that person is feeling and experiencing and who they're with and what they're doing and all the various levels that we go through each and every day. So it holds no stability for me. It doesn't hold any real solid structure. And you can see that through the literature, and talking about postmodernism, depending on which theory we are examining, who is discussing toxic masculinity, the notion of traditional masculinity will alter depending on which standpoint those particular theories are coming from. So again, it holds no substance for me because it doesn't, it's too malleable. It moves too frequently depending on your standpoint epistemology. So I think that's something that needs to be considered, that one, men aren't just men. And I don't think anyone walks around their day thinking, I am woman or I am man, because you've got so many different elements to alter your behaviour in whatever situation that is.
Well, I'd like to end on that note on what Deborah said about malleability of masculinity. I think the biggest takeaway that we can get from here is that masculinity is really a malleable issue. It's all about, you know, what kind of discussions do we have when it comes to talking about masculinity or toxic masculinity, or what is not toxic masculinity, or as Martin has pointed out earlier, perhaps it's just acting out from their own identity. So this is really a very interesting discussion. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining me. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Deborah. It's been fascinating talking to you. And I hope I could have a standalone interview to each one of you. Thank you.